There's a family that's very dear to me, and I've always marveled at the sacrifice that the parents made for their children. When it came time for their children to go to middle school and to high school, and the local public schools where they lived were not up to par, did not promise the academic excellence and the social environment that they were hoping for. So they sent their children to private schools and even to boarding schools eventually. And at first they had all the financial backing, but that did not last very long. And in the end, they had to come out of their own pocket. And they had very limited means, and they had to make big sacrifices. They sold assets, and they compromised their own future, still paying for it today for a few years of schooling, just to open up a little bit wider the doors of possibility for their children. And I've always marveled at that sacrifice. And their kids were barely aware of it, caught up in their lives, as is often the case. Maybe as parents, we mostly do not want our children to be aware of the sacrifices that we're making for them. But that sacrificing for our children or for other family members is a sacrifice that many of us know very deeply. How much we're willing to do for our children, how much. And as parents, unseen or seen, we do what we do. Out of love, out of duty, we open our hearts up wide and we give and we sacrifice. There was a story, I believe it was a few years ago in Italy. There was a cable car that malfunctioned and fell. And there was an Israeli family on board with a whole group of other people. And as the cable car went down, the father curled himself around his 5-year-old son. And his son was the only one out of the 17 people who survived. But where does it come from? What else are we willing to sacrifice for, and why? What are the things that we believe in and are willing to sacrifice ourselves for? It's maybe on our minds these past few weeks more than it's been for a long time. We see Ukrainians flying home to fight for freedom, sometimes with no military training, for their nation. When Zelensky said to Congress last week, fighting is not just about being big, it's about being brave and fighting for what you believe in, he's touching on the truth, that the willingness to sacrifice lifts us up to another place. When we hear him, he was speaking from experience, an actor turned president with not that much clout on the world scene, into a leader of the free world because he was willing to sacrifice for an ideal. Now speaking to all the Western parliaments and the Knesset next week and Congress. This is a truth that we instinctively understand, that being willing to sacrifice raises up your own life and fills it with meaning. And every parent has this experience, or those who can have that experience with other family members. And there suddenly is our child, a different human being than we are, separate, yet so close to us, and it just recenters our whole life. Beautiful. It's also a truth at the very core of our tradition. What was the sacrificial system that we've been reading about that was so important? People gave an animal that most of the time they had raised themselves and they required care and resources, and they offered it up to God. And they did it because it created a reach nichoach, a pleasant fragrance that rose up to the heavens. And what was that pleasant fragrance, says our tradition? It was God saw that the people were willing to sacrifice for a higher purpose, for a divine purpose. And for the individual, after he gave his animal and he watched the column of smoke rise, you can imagine that his heart and mind, from where he was all those many millennia ago, filled with pride and joy and peace. And he felt, I've done something good today. And so in this parsha that we've been reading, that's all about the sacrifices. Of all the sacrifices, the one that was perhaps the most important, that's mentioned the most in the Torah, and that Jeremiah then picks up on in the Haftarah, was the burnt offering, the olah. So there were many other kinds of offerings. There was a sin offering and the wave offering and the well-being offering. There was a cause for a celebration and a communal meal, a barbecue. But the olah was different. The olah was a big animal, and it was burnt entirely, completely, all night long on the altar. The giver received no meat back. It was a complete sacrifice to God. He gave it all with joy. And the commentators explain not only was it a big sacrifice for them, it was also a sacrifice for the priests, because the priest also didn't receive any meat from the sacrifice. And he had to spend all night tending to the sacrifice being burnt. And the Or HaChaim, a Moroccan commentator, said he also had to supply the wood for it. But he too considered that the olah was the highest sacrifice. It was the purest form of sacrifice because there was nothing expected in return. And that's what drove the entire sacrificial system in ancient Israel. And they sacrificed, they gave with full hearts, and it drew God's presence and lifted them. And that was more important to them than anything else. The Midrash recounts that during the sieges of Jerusalem, several times Jerusalem was under siege, that even as the inhabitants were having trouble finding food, when they no longer had the animals to give for the sacrifice, they lowered buckets full of gold to their enemies and said, please give us a sheep for the offering. Because they knew that that consciousness of sacrifice was what uplifted all of them and held them together as a society. So for us, the sacrifice of animals does not work very well. Maybe then it was already a step up from the sacrifice of human beings. But in our day, what our tradition, what our religion asks of us on a daily basis is to sacrifice our needs for our faith, for our community, for the people we love. How we eat, how we do everything. It's all about placing a higher purpose and simply the gratification of all of our desires. And so now we're being called to ponder. And it is not yet on our shores, and hopefully it will never be. But are we willing to sacrifice for a nation? Are we willing to sacrifice for our democratic values, for freedom? And how far are we willing to go? And why were we asleep to the danger, for the need to stand up for so long? We have to believe that if we are called to do so, even if it is accepting a little hardship, changes in prices, the prices at the pump, as we hear, that our hearts too will be aroused, and we too will think, I did something good today. And the smoke of our sacrifice will rise to the heavens and offer up a reach nichoach, a pleasant fragrance to the Almighty. We will know that we too have risen to the challenge and are drawing the divine presence in our midst. Shabbat Shalom.